So we are continuing with Proverbs chapter 12. Whoso loves instruction loves knowledge, but he that hates reproof is brutish. A good man obtains favor of the Lord, but a man of wicked devices will he condemn. A man shall not be established by wickedness, but the root of the righteous shall not be moved. A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband, but she that makes ashamed is as rottenness in his bones. The thoughts of righteous are right, but the counsels of the wicked are deceit. The words of the wicked are to lie and wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright shall deliver them. The wicked are overthrown and are not, but the house of the righteous shall stand. A man shall be condemned according to his wisdom, but he that is of a perverse heart shall be despised. He that is despised and has a servant is better than he that honors himself and lacketh bread. A righteous man regardeth the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. He that tilleth his land shall be satisfied with bread, but he that followeth vain persons is void of understanding. The wicked desires the net of evil men, but the root of the righteous yields fruit. The wicked is snared by the transgression of his lips, but the just shall come out of trouble. A man shall be satisfied with good by the fruit of his mouth, and the recompense of a man's hands shall be rendered unto him. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. A fool's wrath is precisely known, but a prudent man covers shame. He that speaks truth sheweth forth righteousness, but a false witness deceit. There is that speaketh like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise is health. The lip of truth shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Deceit is in the heart of them that imagine evil, but to the counselors of peace is joy. There shall no evil happen to the just, but the wicked shall be filled with mischief. Lying lips are abomination to the Lord, but they that deal truly are his delight. A prudent man conceals knowledge, but the heart of fools proclaimeth foolishness. The hand of the diligent shall bear rule, but the slothful shall be under tribute. Heaviness in the heart of man maketh it stoop, but a good word maketh it glad. The righteous is more excellent than his neighbor, but the way of the wicked seduceth them. The slothful man roasteth not that which he took in hunting, but the substance of a diligent man is precious. In the way of righteousness is life, and the pathway thereof there is no death. The first verse is our orienting verse. We have, whoso loveth instruction loveth knowledge, but he that hates reproof is brutish. This is a verse that we've seen before in the Proverbs. It's a warning against selfishness. We learn through instruction. If there is one that hates instruction, they believe that they have all the answers, or that they don't desire to learn, they don't desire truth, they don't desire an understanding that might help them in their life and help them help others. Verse 3 says, A man shall not be established by wickedness, but the root of the righteous shall not be moved. Now what stands out to me here is the word established. A man shall not be established by wickedness. And what does it mean to be established? To establish something is to bring it forth in the world. It is, in some sense, connected to that word, root. It is the beginning, it is the initiation. Those that are established in wickedness, I think, by definition, are lost. They are in the darkness. Those that are wicked are evil. Now, two terms that in the modern age don't quite have the type of sway that they should. Against truth. They don't seek to know what is right. What is right to them is for their own gain. It is to fulfill that selfish desire. It is to inflate that ego, regardless of the path that they take. Truth for them is success and the proliferation of the self. Now in wickedness and darkness, what can be known, there is something that can be known. That every conscious mind has a light, I guess we can call it, that has a certain degree of luminosity. But a light bound by nothing, a light that attempts not to discover its origin, is a lonely thing. It is an unfortunate thing. It is something that betrays principle. It is something that betrays solid information. It is something that betrays reality. They set up camp in their own minds and build their own narrative. Their own narrative by which they can, again, fulfill their selfish desires. But the root of the righteous shall not be moved. We think of stability. We think of a root that is firmly in place, that is resistant to heavy winds. It's resistant to the profound change that occurs. Not that it is against change, but it can adapt to change and resist the type of change that would otherwise uproot it and cause confusion and chaos. A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband, but she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness in his bones. Now it's interesting, a crown is a symbol of authority. A king is given a crown once he has been appointed to that position. And so it's interesting that the woman in this sense is anointing essentially the man. She is symbolically giving him the authority to act as the leader. Now the only thing that can do this really is that of, well, not the only thing, but the thing that comes to mind is wisdom. This is something that we have seen before, referred to in the female, that it is her responsibility to be discerning and directing and nurturing of the more active principle. But she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness in his bones. Here I think of a temptress. Again, just like the wicked in the previous example, that shall not be established, that shall not be rooted in wickedness. This type of woman is the one that uses her crowning authority, let's say, to judge in such a way as to make one understand or to lead one to believe that they are guilty of something. And the shame that results of it is the understanding that they have committed some wrong, and this wrong has some consequence. I don't think necessarily that we are talking about any potential shame that can come from a righteous accusation. I think here it is implied that this ashamedness is for the sake of being ashamed. It is to instill this in confidence through embarrassment and humiliation for its own sake, and this, of course, is wrong. For truth and judgment to take place, we understand that there are proper places. We understand that there is nuance in the way that we judge, in the way that we tell the truth, in the way that we approach ones that we love. But in the case of rottenness in one's bones, this is to take away from the union and that commitment that two people make together, a solid union, and to corrupt that union by making it weaker. Sort of this symbolic analogy of the bones, this structural support of the body. To disease that support, to make it weak and brittle, is to make the union itself weak and brittle. Now, the other word that I would use to support the claim that this is a deliberate thing on the part of this, at least the second part of this verse, the scenario in which the woman is deliberate in her reductionism for the sake of reducing, is the word that is to make. But she that makes ashamed. This implies that she puts together this mechanism, this distorting mechanism that causes this guilt, this loathsome unwillingness to engage in life. It is to capture, I think through wickedness, but a certain degree of understanding, to capture the free-flowing feelings of the heart. To intensify them for her own selfish purposes, where her rightful place is beside her husband, but it's not beside as in necessarily subject to. We can talk about subject to, but again, the crown is a symbol of authority. She is the one that decides on that authority. Now, just like the crown, it is not the authority itself. We don't see that power when we look at a king. We see a man when we look at a king. We know he's a king. We know that he has authority because of the crown. We know that he can exercise it by certain means. In the old days, the king inherited his crown by hereditary succession, sometimes through good deeds, but often the former. And to further reflect on it, the one that is responsible for that ordination must also be the one that is responsible for knowing What are they responsible for knowing? Well, they're responsible for knowing the type of characteristics, the virtues that a man should have in order to raise and provide for a successful family. And the role that she plays is that of this facilitator, this, again, ordinator. She is that nurturing, accepting component. She is taking that wild masculine energy and shaping it and saying, this is your responsibility. I have ordained you with this crown, and now this is what you must do for me and for your subjects. Essentially, in this way, the subjects are their own autonomous agents, obviously. But there are certain duties that must be fulfilled by someone at some time. Otherwise, the agents are not a cohesive whole. Without a king, then it's anarchy. There's no united whole. And the point here, especially in the context of the second half of that verse, the potential to weaken the structure. The woman that is not really virtuous, she's not very wise, she's wicked perhaps. We can see how this sort of person, for whatever reason, she willfully engages in that relationship and that unity through marriage. She does so, again, it's selfishness. She attempts to retain the whole for herself, her own selfish desires, rather than for the sake of the whole. And just like there have been many kingdoms, there have been many empires that have collapsed under this weight of trying to integrate different agents, different collections of people, different identities, but they were not able to do it well. Now there is, I think, quite a lofty principle in here that has to do with the integration of, again, whether it be a people into a kingdom, or whether it be people into a family. Each person's role in that unit or that structure serves a purpose. And without an appropriate purpose, or with a lowly view, and again an ashamed view, or a view that is subversive, just as there have been many kings of old that have attempted to rule by, again, in their own interest, doing terrible things to their subjects, angering those that are working with them to run that body, to keep that body in an integral, have an integral shape and form, have its own strong identity. The woman's role in the identity of a marriage is fundamental. Now I have to wonder about our modern age. We live in an era where we strive for a certain type of equality, that responsibilities of the sexes, while there are still many unspoken, there has been an attempt to level that playing field completely, and even more than that, to say that any differences that there happen to be between male and female are inconsequential, that they have no place in modern society. Now, I think as far as feminism is concerned, I think that they do have solid standing in terms of the allowing the mind of women to benefit our society and to participate in our development and our growth. To have a society without that component, I think we would be much less whole. We'd be 50% less. But it's not the case that before we had that movement that we were 50% less. We had certain ideas about the woman's place in the family, some of which were right, some of which perhaps could use some modification. I think we also have to consider the outliers. There's always going to be outliers in society. That's not necessarily our place to stamp them out, but it is our responsibility everybody's responsibility, whether they are outliers or they are central figures. When I say central figures and I say outliers, I mean the people that follow the practices and principles that are necessary for a strong, cohesive whole. Now, there are many reasons why somebody may not be able to follow a certain type of practice, perhaps because of infertility or because useful character attributes or natural gifts are useful in a specific context that's, outside of that family structure. It's whatever it might be. But even though that may be the case, it is not that we should strive for the fringes for the sake of the fringes. We should strive for the unification, for understanding, for righteous behavior, for principled living. Now, the last comment here to tie all of this together would be to ask the question, especially in the context of the feminist movement, and more specifically the latter waves of that movement, which I think have been more regressive and damaging to society, whereas the first perhaps were beneficial. If it is the case that we have the participation of more women in public life, or in corporate affairs, or in the securing and provision of material resources for the raising of a family. The first statement of participation in public life, that's not, I don't think that's an accurate term to use, but it was the first one that came to mind. If it is the case that this is the trend that we are moving along, then I think we have to understand that there are going to be consequences with that. Family cohesiveness will not be as strong. Family dynamics will be different. And as it is, as independent as our society is, we leave a lot of room open for indifference and outsourcing of truly valuable things that should be done by the parents or by the extended family. And this role of the woman as the anointer and as the holder of this wisdom and the decider, that role doesn't just go away. It may be dispersed between the two sexes, between the man and the woman, but certainly I have this overwhelming feeling that something is lost because of it. I think in particular it has something to do with the children. It has something to do with how they are being raised, and again, the outsourcing of that responsibility, that maternal responsibility, to some disinterested body, some corporate structure that is designed to help children, no doubt, but is no substitute for the love of a mother and the education that she can provide her children. Now, I said something earlier about this 50% business, that we would be 50% reduced. Now, obviously that's not correct, because before we weren't 50% reduced. I made this concession earlier, but I think it warrants another reflection, another comment. The traditional approach to family rearing, that the man works and the woman helps raise the child and produces the home, I think that this structure it requires extended family, I think, in order to make it effective. It requires strong communal associations. That if the woman is responsible for the making of the home in that way, she is also responsible for the making of a community in a certain way. It is this putting together and this direction, this authority and this wisdom that she possesses. And so in more traditional societies, they retain this strong female element, I think. And it's something that we lose when they go off into the workforce. So for the majority, I would say that perhaps a more traditional approach is best for us. But in light of the 50% comment, I would say that, again, the outliers exist. And there are many of us that will not fall into that mold. It doesn't mean that we are wicked. It just means that there are circumstances beyond our control that led us a path that's different from that process of rearing a family. And the utility of the individual in that case can still be quite a benefit to society, whether male or female. Okay, so a few days have passed since I did my last recording. And this is to serve as a break between that last bit of audio and the new. The words of the wicked are to lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright shall deliver them. Now what I'm getting from this verse is deception. I think of a shady figure that is representative of this wicked person that lies in wait. They have their own intention. They have their own directed goal in mind that is supreme to all others. That there is nothing beyond their own self-interest they could possibly be attending to, and so that they lie in wait underneath a cover of perhaps mutual reciprocity to deceive an individual until they have found themselves in a situation where they can take advantage of that individual and spill their blood. Now continuing that, in the second half of the verse, but the mouth of the upright shall deliver them. And so what does it mean in this context? How would this wicked person be delivered? Well, if the wicked person is lying in wait, under the orders and the direction of their own self-interest, then what they are going to be delivered from is that very thing, is to liberate them from the constraints of the self. Now I have to be very particular here, because I think it's easy to be misconstrued what I'm saying. When I say the constraints of the self, I mean the self as it exists in totality. That this thing that we consider to be the self is inherently, can be inherently restrictive. Now it has its own identity, it has its own purpose, but everything has to exist within a proper context. And so to give this a little bit more light, let's say we imagine the self in relation to that which has allowed it to be. And we say, okay, that which has allowed it to be has within its understanding the way that things are. If that thing understands the way that things are, and the self is inherently corrupted, it is, because of its nature, limited in the amount of information that it can take in. Its processing speed perhaps is not as fast as it should be to be able to make total sense of reality. And often it makes mistakes. It can be deceived by the heart. The self is a very corruptible institution of the human conscious mind. And so when I say to liberate it from the restraints of the self, what in effect I am saying is to actually recognize the actual restraints that ought to be placed on the self due to the way that things are. And the first step to do that is to recognize that the self is not all that there is, that infinite regressive abstraction is false, and that the true thing to do would be to listen to those of the upright that deliver those self-interested people from themselves, to give them a broader scope, a way of seeing, to be able to lift. We say upright, we say righteous. It all implies this looking up instead of looking down, and this looking down sort of implies a narrow view of things, whereas looking up or looking out implies a horizon. It implies a much greater expanse of information that one can peer into and see and take in. Now, of course, when we do that, there is responsibilities that come along with that, which then the discerning individual becomes all that much more valuable. And in effect, we have this sort of new self, this new understanding of its identity. The wicked are overthrown and are not, but the house of the righteous shall stand. A man shall be commended according to his wisdom, but he that is of perverse heart shall be despised. I'm not sure if there's too much that I have to add to verse 7. The wicked are overthrown and are not, but the house of the righteous shall stand. I suppose it's interesting to think about, well, what are the ways in which the wicked are overthrown? You know, this is one of these prompting verses, because it'll say something declarative, but in the mind of one that reads this, it's up to them to come to some understanding of why that might be the case. Moreover from that is to take the little tidbits of wisdom that are sprinkled out here and there and trying to connect those dots. So the wicked are overthrown. Again, the wicked, there are two paths to wickedness, the indirect and the direct. The indirect, if it's walked far enough, which I think can occur to what we were just talking about, of the delusion of one's own self-interest, or some willful walking towards untruth, which again I think can circle back into self-interest and manipulation of one's own desires for their own purposes. So in either case, whether it be unintentional selfishness or willful selfishness that can lead to the same result, and both conditions are wicked. I don't think that they are the same in terms of the hierarchy. I think that the willful is much more damning than that of the ignorance, or the ignorant. But again, I have to return to the question, well, certainly there have been no shortage of rulers and individuals out there that have gained an upper hand due to their deceitful ways, under wicked ways, under ways of blindness. And it's difficult, I think, at times to reconcile exactly how it is that the wicked are punished. One possibility, I suppose, is that since the wicked are fundamentally oriented towards the self and not necessarily interested towards the truth, that there is a distribution, probabilistic distribution, that would, this is an uncharitable, or rather not uncharitable, rather unartistic, unpoetic view of seeing it, I suppose, but we can explore possible secondary avenues after this. But I think that there is something to be said for those individuals that choose not to know what is and make decisions based on something that is less than that which is, compared to those who are concerned about what is and would like to make decisions about what is. Now, there are various levels of sophistication in terms of seeing what is, what ought to be. I think there are various levels of experiencing that as well. Some people are much more intuitively intelligent than others, let's say, and intuitively meaning that, again, this is difficult territory, but intuitive in the sense that, perhaps intuitive is not the right word, but there is a degree of intuition after knowing a certain set of principles that allows one to, that leads them towards more effective decision making. I think one of the things that's on my mind that won't disappear is the movie Forrest Gump. You have a very simple person, simple in terms of IQ, simple in terms of lifestyle, and yet he was instilled with a set of basic principles by his mother that allowed him to become extremely successful in the open world, just by doing what was right and by paying attention to what he was doing, albeit simple. The simplicity coupled with this intense discipline, I think of his experience in war, when he's cleaning the guns, he's very meticulous. It doesn't take a lot of understanding to do the task, but the task can be done well. He maintained discipline throughout his time in the service. He constantly showed up. He was there when he needed to be. He did his duty. He listened to his superiors. When he got out of the military, he was trying to do what was right by others. He was obviously constantly worried about Jenny. He had this love for this woman that didn't love him, but he was committed to love for the sake of love. It wasn't, the interesting dichotomy is that Jenny's life was filled with this false love. It was filled with this wickedness, being molested by her father, growing up in poor circumstances, and then just sort of continuing a lifestyle that probably involved some revelations, but also that wickedness constantly corrupted her sense and her vision of what her life could be or how it ought to be. It certainly prevented her from seeing the love that was being offered, true love that was being offered to her by Forrest Gump. Forrest, obviously, despite his difficulties with Jenny, continued his life and became very successful, constantly paying tribute to those that he loved. And so it's a story of the perseverance of the good. In that case, it outlines what a very simple man with a certain set of principles can do with goodness. And you see how wickedness corrupts and destroys. It's not a force for building good. And even when it does find a foothold, because of course Jenny, her identity was bound up in her childhood living under this wicked thumb of her father, being molested and this sort of thing. But her father was an alcoholic. we don't know in the story what happened to her father. Even if we did know, we would probably dismiss it in comparison to the rest of the story, because his ending was probably quite sad. He probably passed from cirrhosis of the liver or something, or found himself in prison. And so I think that this story sort of highlights this verse of how the wicked come to an end, even if they have and establish some temporary identity that has some authority over others. Ultimately, it ends in this implosion and this confusion, this disintegration. Whereas, conversely, in Forrest Gump's case, and in Jenny's case, I think because of Forrest's love, this is this unifying behavior. And now, not every experience that Forrest had was this completely stable and solid existence. He risked a lot in order to have experiences and come to know things. And from those experiences, he made effective decisions based on certain principles. So similarly, in verse 8, we have, a man shall be commended according to his wisdom, but he that is a perverse heart shall be despised. It's similar in the sense that we are now using wisdom for righteousness. We are using the perverse heart for the wicked. Now, two different terms that come from and are nested within the previous verse. That is, wisdom is of a righteous person, where they have this dual relationship that the wisdom leads to righteousness, and the righteous are wise. And the perverse of heart, this confusion of the drives and the emotions of man, not necessarily confusion, because without direction, certainly they are in a bit of a confused state. There's some natural direction that of certain impulses to hunger and thirst, and those that are sexual in nature, but they're very lowly. They don't have that thing that's just beyond the animalistic, that is the reasoned and the principled and the meaningful. Here it says the perverse, the deliberate obstinance. Again, the contrariness, the frowardness. But he that is of a perverse heart shall be despised. I think of, in this example, I'm using a lot of movie references, but Cool Hand Luke, I think, is a good example of this verse. Cool Hand Luke, his character he's a cool guy, and he has a spirit to him. He has a strong spirit to him, but he is continually corrupted. And this corruption and this perversion of his heart is the thing that leads to his undoing. He makes many allies through his discipline, through his demeanor, his cool behavior, his calm and collected disposition, his ability to lead and make effective decisions in certain circumstances. But the whole of it doesn't necessarily match the parts. And he'll design these grand schemes, but there's nothing at the end of the line. It's a righteous self-interestedness. As strange as that might sound, it is contrary. And I think that this is a perversion. It's this chasm and this split between different levels of one's identity. And at the end, I think that this, at least to the watcher, there is this despising that does come from Luke's continual failures. There's the admiration of his character at times, but his continual failures and that perverse heart is certainly the thing that leads to the negative opinion. He that is despised and has a servant is better than he that honoureth himself and lacketh bread. Now this verse I have difficulty with. He that is despised and has a servant is better than he that honours himself and lacks bread. Now what could this mean? Now he that is despised. Now in the previous verse we have the person that is of perverse heart shall be despised. So we can make an inference that if this type of person is despised, then we can make a substitution. He that is of perverse heart and has a servant. And when I think of this, I think of the person that has enough wealth to afford somebody to assist him in life. The ancient world, no stranger to servants and to slaves, is better than he that honoureth himself and lacketh bread. Now, honouring oneself can have a potential upside and a potential downside. Potential upside, to honour the self, makes sense only when the self is geared towards God. It's geared towards that which is. If it is, in the flip side of that coin, if it is honoring the self for the selfish desires of the individual, then it is pride and it is shameful. And the overall point of this, he that honoureth himself and lacketh bread, I think is the latter case. Because, well, not necessarily, because there's two potential roads that we can talk about here as well. There's the one case in which the honouring of oneself has led to that lack of bread, or it is the case of just unfortunate circumstance in which a man finds himself in poverty and yet still honours himself to a certain degree. Now, just like in the case of the body, where you might have this might be a bit into the weeds, but a case like a respiratory acidosis versus a metabolic acidosis, two conditions involving low bodily pH, but the presentation of which is quite different. And so, within the possibilities, we have to draw from it something that is reasonable, that logically follows. So I don't think that we can necessarily say that he that honors himself in good faith is the man that we're talking about here. We're talking about he that honors himself too highly, that in either case has led him to his poverty, or the unfortunate man that has found himself in a state of poverty because of his circumstance, and yet continues to be this wicked, corrupt, prideful individual. And you compare that with the man of the perverse heart, the cool hand Luke. And yet he's done enough in his life to have a servant. He's accumulated resources. He has sacrificed for the future. Now, we can't guarantee that this is something that he's gained by virtuous practices. Perhaps there's a degree of wickedness in his success. But we see all sorts of these types of people. People that pursue money for the sake of money. They marry women that are very much younger than them, perhaps 20, 30 years younger, and they forego having children. They live for themselves, and yet they have quite a bit of material wealth. And so what can we say? Of course, in the verse we see that it is better in the case of the perverse heart, the successful perverse heart, versus a sort of a prideful poverty. And we must ask ourselves why that might be, because we're taking two negative things, seemingly here, and comparing them together. And I'll say this, at least in the case of the former, despite that they are despised, despite that they have a perverse heart, like in the case of Cool Hand Luke, they have made something in the world. Their actions have been fruitful. Now I'd have to wonder about the degree to which they have achieved based on, well, let me rephrase, I would have to wonder about that which they achieved in life and the level of perverseness or depravity that was required to gain that success and that status in life. But we can't be comparing one high to one low. We have to compare them as though they have an equal standard in this case. And so the person that has achieved, despite their weaknesses, is better than that which of a man that we find who is prideful, that has a high opinion of themselves, but they can't quite, their actions can't quite match up to their opinions or their abstractions. And that's a difficult thing, because I think that there's a bit of that in all of us. There's a bit of that in me, this pridefulness that can lead to inaction. And I also worry about becoming a successful person and not retaining the way, not understanding what it means to a sophisticated degree to love another person and to really experience life for what it has to offer. Verse 10, a righteous man regards the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. Now this is another one of those verses that can have a few different interpretations. The righteous man regards the life of his beast. Immediately I go to a physical example. I think of a farmer that has an animal that assists him in the farming of his crop. And saying this righteous man, this man of good standing, of good ways, of good principle, regards, and by extension pays attention to, has care for that which is below him, that which serves him. Because ultimately he serves that which is above him. And if he is to be blessed by his service, certainly he should bless those creatures, or perhaps the people, that serve him. But the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. This is one I think that we see today in contemporary United States. we have a lot of good-heartedness. We have a lot of behavior that is conducted under the, I think it's often under the guise, but under the unintentioned guise of love and of inclusiveness. In the modern day, we often, and increasingly so, make the trade of our liberties for our securities. And as we make that trade, the ability for the individual to walk back on that trade decreases year after year. And I think that within that trade, the trade of one's own freedom of choice for that of safety, comfort, and security, that safety and comfort becomes worse than the tyranny and the burdens that are held by the free people. The burdens of freedom being not limited to, but certainly importantly, that of what man ought to do with his life, what he ought to do in the case of no other man telling him what he should do or should not do. It's difficult to listen to the world. It's difficult to listen to reality. It's often very harsh. It often stirs a lot of emotions, and it's easy to find and to flee to something that masks that pain and that anxiety. To find something that continually disrupts the attention so that they don't have to focus on it. But herein lies the tender mercies of the wicked. Because the wicked, as we know from verse 6, the words of the wicked are to lie in wait for blood. This is what we see here, whether intentioned or unintentioned. We can explore both paths. Let's take the unintentioned first, certainly the worst and more damning, as I've said before. These tender mercies, whether it be on an institutional level or a personal level, they offer the freedom from burden with the price of tyranny. They offer forgiveness where it may not be in their authority or in their power to forgive. They forgive things that need to be corrected so that the individual doesn't make the same mistakes. They need to be corrected so that they can actually see a greater expanse. We talked about the reorientation of the selfish person from sort of this narrow, constrained mind into something that is liberated to looking up to that which is. The wicked are the ones that would like to see the person imprisoned within their self, with their own within their own ego, their own desires. And what I see here, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel, this cruelty is within this twisting, the twisting of that experience of the individual that is being continually removed and forced back into a darkened space. A space where before perhaps they understood it, now they don't. And now the only safe place for them is inside of the self. And when the self becomes even too suffocating and restrictive, they will further disassociate that self from reality. They'll create a new identity and try to live in that They try to expand it, make their own illustration of what fantasy that they want to live. And yet they fall further and further into delusion. They become easier and easier to manipulate by the wicked. Whereas again in the first part of this verse, the righteous man regards the life of his beast, his life himself certainly regarded by the way of things and by his success in life. He gives this beast the care that's necessary for the duty that it is to perform. The regard is attention. It is concern for, its care. There is a reciprocating relationship between that of what is lower and that of what is higher. That there must be regard for and attention to this relationship. He that tilleth his land shall be satisfied with bread, but he that follows vain persons is void of understanding. This is a verse, no doubt, about the orientation of the self, the alignment of the self. That within the action of tilling the land, you are sacrificing for the future. You're not concerned about the overinflated sense of the self or its worth. It is not, to till the land is not seen as something that is beneath that person, whereas perhaps a more self-absorbed, vain person would follow more superficial avenues. They wouldn't do the groundwork that would lead to some sort of prosperity. They would rather have and receive prosperity by some means of, what would we say, in some sense it would be considered lazy behavior. Parasitic behavior is probably the best way to describe it. And like a parasite, they become a drain on its host, feeding off of the accomplishments of others, accomplishments and fruits of others. The wicked desireth the net of evil men, but the root of the righteous yieldeth fruit. So this word net, we have a few different definitions for that word. It could be a traditional net, like a net for catching fish. It is an object that is composed of an interwoven structure of some flexible material. It could either keep things in or keep things out. I think of a net on a tent that serves as a barrier between the internal and the external. It keeps the pests away, and it keeps the individual on the inside free from insult or molestation by the external environment. We can also think of net in terms of that which has been reduced after some charge or deduction. I think for these purposes we can use the former example, that of a meshwork. Now what's interesting here is that we have the wicked desire the net of evil men, the separation between the wicked and evil men. And so we must consider how exactly are the wicked to be different from that of evil men. Is it the case that the wicked do not reach the heights of absolute evil, that they are on this path, this journey towards untruth, towards dissolution, towards darkness? In this way we can imagine the wicked person as that of one becoming evil. And in this way, if they are to desire the net of the evil person, they are to desire that which encapsulates and captures something that they can use for their own selfish purposes. Because we have established that the wicked are selfish people. What makes them wicked is, in a sense, the net of the self that has become so restrictive that seeing above and beyond it is difficult for them. Their pursuits in life, while they may not be entirely for the purposes of evil, that which can be directed outside of the self, but for purposes of antagonism. I suppose it can be argued that in the case of the truly evil, is it even possible that one can be, just as one is geared towards the good and would like to understand the standards therein, which inherently are outside of the self, although they involve the participation of the self through the willing sacrifice of certain things, certain material comforts, certain feelings and desires. Surely the evil person must understand something of the good to understand the opposite, to understand the evil. One must have a certain sense of what is in order to desire that which is not. So when we are considering the difference between the evil and the wicked, I think we can say that the differences between them rely on degree, that the evil and the wicked, perhaps the wicked have a lesser degree of immorality compared to those that are purely evil. But more importantly, I would say that the fundamental difference between the wicked and the evil is that wickedness is not always consciously directed. One can perform wicked acts without being aware of the potential consequences, or that their actions are, in fact, wicked. And wicked, again, in this case, being immoral, antagonistic to that of the good, self-absorbed, just oriented towards fulfilling selfish desires. So it allows for both conscious and unconscious or pure ignorance of the way that one should be, while evil is always something that is always something that is directed. It is always a conscious decision. That instead of not really understanding how the selfish way of one's behavior can affect another or can affect one's own life, the evil conduct themselves in such a way that deliberately harms others or brings about a state of chaos and disorder for the sake of chaos and disorder. And so the wicked desires the net of evil men. As we said at the outset, this could be a transition point between degree, between someone beginning to, for the lack of a better term, enlighten themselves, to the broader way of being, the directed way towards that which is geared toward the capturing of power, the securing of the fulfillment of one's own hedonistic pleasures. But again, this desire on the part of the wicked may not entirely be intentional. But the root of the righteous yields fruit. The root is something that's fundamental. It draws sustenance from the earth. A root that is competent, a root, in this case, that is righteous, that is morally upright, that is after the truth, will find those necessary nutrients within the earth. They will be efficient at drawing that for their own purposes. And because of that efficiency, it will yield fruit. The wicked is snared by the transgression of his lips, but the just shall come out of trouble. That is to say, those that are not surely after that which is good and right will find themselves caught in this snare because of the misstep of their words, just as if one was walking in the forest and they got themselves caught in a trap. And since the just are concerned about solving the puzzle that is the maze of what we might consider to be trouble, they will be more likely to find the escape route, the escape hatch, compared to the wicked, who are unable to see the whole picture. Again, their picture much reduced to that of the narrow confines of the self. A man shall be satisfied with good by the fruit of his mouth, and the recompense of a man's hand shall be rendered unto him. So what might it mean? The expression, fruit of the mouth. Fruit obviously is something that grows. It is something that is planted for the purposes of nourishing. It is something that somebody has taken upon themselves to have a care for the future in order to sow that which will be nourishing. It has the potential to nourish in the future. They make certain sacrifices. Now, if we are to consider this nourishment and the attention towards the future for greater prosperity, given current sacrifice, and if we had to apply this analogy to speech instead of just a agricultural analogy, I think that this can come down through relationships. It can come down through a solid family structure. For in good relationships, whether they be mercantile or economic or familial, there must be an establishment of trust. In the case of the latter, there must be love. There must be a strong binding force that connects these relations together. And this binding force is, I think, made of sacrifices. It is made of attention. In the case of the economic relationship, one must do all sorts of things in order to go out and find the individual that has a particular material good that is worthwhile to our good person of interest. They must establish that relationship, again, one of trust. They must be just in their dealings with them so that they can continue to deal with them. In the case of the latter, in the case of the family, there are sacrifices of selfishness. That is to say, bits and pieces of the self are sacrificed for the greater good, for the offspring of a particular individual or of a partner. The desires that once held and were indulged in prior to the establishment of serious, love-bound relationships begin to become an impediment to the maintenance of those bonds, and the sacrifice therein is what is appropriate. And by such means, the man will be satisfied with good. They will be rewarded with love and kind. They will be rewarded with a greater fulfillment, a greater experience of existence. And the recompense of a man's hand shall be rendered unto him. That is, he shall be compensated for his actions. He will be rewarded. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. Now the fool, just like the wicked, is a selfish person. It's foolish to think that I, as an individual, understand everything, or that even that which I can see with my own eyes is accurate. Now I can say that in a number of different ways. It certainly can be physical. There are examples in the physical sphere in which that which we see may be corrupting to our mapping of reality, but also in the metaphorical sense in terms of seeing that on the part of the fool, his behaviors, his actions, these are all justified within his mind. He believes that his course of action is right because for him and for his goals, they are in alignment. He does not consider that which is greater, that which is beyond the goals of self-interest. But he that pays attention to multiple inputs and recognizes that he does not have all the answers is more likely to come to a greater understanding and perhaps correct a delusion that they had suffered under, so that now they can see more clearly the path that they are to walk is a bit more polished. It's more visible within the cluttered landscape of existence. A fool's wrath is presently known, but a prudent man covereth shame. Now this is one that is not readily understandable to me, but there is an intuition here that this is quite an important verse. So a fool's wrath is presently known. A wrath is an extreme anger. We can think of wrath in terms of somebody that has been wronged, or somebody that is perhaps psychologically unstable. And this wrath is, in some sense, a form of retribution. It is a result of some recognition that some perceived justice or punishment because of some perceived injustice must be carried out. Now the fool, of course, his judgment is obscured. It is obscured by ignorance, and perhaps by arrogance, as in the case of the wicked. This is what makes him foolish. The fool is often somebody that is recognizably off of the beaten path. The fool, compared to the masses, is different in kind and in character. Perhaps some event in his childhood, perhaps some misguided direction of a parent had led him into a state of being in which this person lacks good sense or good judgment. They find difficulty providing an appropriate account to their judgments. And so what's easiest to do is to produce an account that does not require a sustained effort of attention. The fool perhaps is quick to make a judgment, again without a formal procedure of understanding of what is, that would lead him to the understanding of what is. And so for the multitude, the person that which is considered foolish or lacking good sense or judgment is known, because he deviates so far from that multitude that is easily seen. But a prudent man covereth shame. Now, unlike our foolish man, he's not much concerned about how people view him, even though his actions, his behavior are so far out of that which is seemingly obvious. He is so unwise and so ignorant that he is unaware of any potential shame that would befall him. Or rather, certainly the opinions of others that would cause shame in an individual. This shame, a response, a natural response, in which one's self evaluates their behavior. It's often quite a negative experience. And through that negative experience, there is a motivating factor for change to take place. Now, the prudent man is one that is wise, one that is judicious. He's thoughtful. He cares for the future. He covers shame. Now, there's a few different ways I think that we can go about seeing this. To cover something is to obscure it. In this way, this shame can be his own business. It is recognized by him, and he covers it. He covers it so that he can correct his behavior. He can correct his way of thinking that may have led to a poor judgment. Another way of understanding this could be to interpret to cover as a way of protecting. That instead of succumbing to this profoundly painful feeling of humiliation by the understanding of some wrong or foolish behavior, he covers this shame with a sense of understanding. And rather than be consumed by these feelings, he is rather prompted to self-reflection. Rather than devolve into a negative spiral, he uses it as a ladder or a staircase to climb upwards towards that which is true, towards something that corrects his mistakes. He that speaketh truth sheweth forth righteousness, but a false witness deceit. There is that speaketh like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise is health. The piercings of a sword, obviously something that is damaging. For one's tongue to be In this way, they certainly are considered wicked, that they are after not the good, but that which divides, that which produces a distracting response, that is, something that perverts one's attention, that is, something that is not truthful, but it is bound up in deception. And the tongue of the wise is health. Health is something that is solid, something that is unburdened by an illness, a detraction from one's optimal state of being. The lip of truth shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. And here we see that the speech is something that is anchored to reality, whereas the lying tongue is not. It's temporary. It is the willful expression of the person at the moment. But just like a particular aroma in the breeze, it is picked up and swept away. Deceit is in the heart of them that imagine evil, but to the counselors of peace is joy. So the first part of this verse, deceit is in the heart of them that imagine evil. It is the conscious direction of the mind that is perverting all of these emotions and desires towards that end, towards the evil end. And so what normally would excite a person through righteous means, or that which is good, like spending time perhaps with family, or having an intimate conversation with one that one loves. Instead, the individual receives no satisfaction in that sort of experience, but rather, as we have said before, with the dagger, the sword that pierces. This type of behavior, this imagination of evil, is what prompts their heart to provide them with feedback. The feedback that what they are doing is right, that it is pleasurable, that it is desirable. But to the counselors of peace is joy. That is, those who advise in such a way to produce a state of calmness, a state of security. This, in an opposite manner to the one that we just described, produces these feelings of joy. This is an alignment towards the truth. That is, the peaceful situation is the one that produces the happiness, rather than that of war that excites. There shall no evil happen to the just, but the wicked shall be filled with mischief. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but they that deal truly are his delight. A prudent man concealeth knowledge, but the heart of fools proclaimeth foolishness. Again, this prudent man, this wise man, he is taking in him this knowledge. He is concealing it because he finds it valuable. He wants to hold on to it. But the heart of fools proclaims foolishness. That they are and they desire nothing but, just like the wicked, a selfish view of the world. That is, their way is always right. That they are not willing to listen to somebody that has a different opinion that actually may be the way of things. And so the fool is foolish for the sake of foolishness. The hand of the diligent shall bear rule, but the slothful shall be under tribute. that is, those who are continually having their gaze directed towards the future, are continually working towards some better condition, who are behaving rightfully, morally. These are the people that are able to appropriately accept the responsibility of ruling, or of, what would we say, directing, because they know the way that one should be directed. But the slothful, that of the lazy, that of the insecure, that of the foolish, that of the wicked, they shall be under tribute. They will be making contribution to the diligent that bear rule. Heaviness in the heart of a man makes it stoop, but a good word makes it glad. Now, I'm sure we all understand to a certain degree what a stooping heart feels like. It is depressed, it is oriented downward, is a negative pulling feeling. It's an anxious feeling, it's an insecure feeling. The good word is something that is true. It improves that condition of its downward nature. It gives it a sense of purpose, perhaps. It allows it to orient its chaotic dealings or chaotic desires and feelings around something that is tangible, something that is known, something that gives the heart confidence. It reverses its stupor into a state of gladness. Certainly one way to solve the stupor of the heart is to resolve the dilemma that led it there in the first place, which requires conscious self-reflection. It requires the willingness to change. It requires the willingness to back away from that which is believed to be known and to be open to something that may provide better answers. The righteous is more excellent than his neighbor, but the way of the wicked seduces them. So in the same way, the righteous or the wicked comes in, again, full of the self and the egotistical desires. Perhaps they present themselves righteously, but what they are after is something that is perverse. It is something that is that detracts from a stable pillar. It wishes to move into a state of confusion and disorder. This seduction comes under some cloak. It is not seen, and it grasps that which is desired by the wicked heart, the wicked mind. The slothful man roasteth not that which he took in hunting, but the substance of a diligent man is precious. Here we have a relatively straightforward proverb of behavior. A man that is not continually after that which will sustain him will not have anything to sustain him. The one that is diligent, the one that constantly gets up, puts forth the effort, that substance is valuable or precious because it was procured under rightful means. There is nothing that would pervert the enjoyment of that substance. It is innocent. In the way of righteousness is life, and in the pathway thereof there is no death. An interesting proverb, because in some sense none of us live forever. And so this proverb must not be talking about the individual, but rather a collective, a group of people that believe a certain thing, believe in a certain way, and their way is the thing that persists, not the individuals. Again, and in the pathway thereof there is no death. That way continues. It is the thing that succeeds. It finds its way out of trouble. It is the thing that sees the path, understands which way to go. They are not parasitic by their nature. They are upright. They are understanding. They are discerning. They care for their young. They provide them with the principles and the education that was necessary for them to succeed. So that concludes chapter 12. We'll begin next time with Proverbs chapter 13.